All right. So first off, thank you so much for joining our grad talk on education. Today's session is pretty much for you to learn about not only what different opportunities there are in education, but also to see how the application process is and how financial aid works with GMS funding. Everyone on this call is a Gates Millennium Scholar, and so and education is clearly one of our 7 funded areas. I do want to note, though, even though it's one of the 7 funded areas, there are some fields in education that are not fundable. An example of that is mental health education is not fundable. So just please be aware you do have to fill out something called a graduate program inquiry form, which we will be going over later in this presentation. All right, let's hit it off. I'm going to first give a chance for our GMS APISF staff members to introduce themselves. My name is Colin D. I'm the Campus Engagement Manager for GMS, and I've been working with GMS for 5 years now. I'm going to pass this over to Helen.
Hi everyone, Helen Beaudreau here, Director of GMS APISF. Just want to say it's really exciting that you all have joined us here, and looks like we have a well-rounded program ahead, so we're really excited for Colin and Leangela to lead this for our team.
Leangela?
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Leangelo Acuna. I am a program assistant here at APIASF, GMS, and I've been here about almost 2 years now in February, and so yeah, really excited to be here, really excited to see the speakers of this webinar and what they have to offer.
Great. Ariane?
Hi everyone, this is Ariane Martin, and I'm program manager with the GMS APIS organization. I've been here for about 2.5 years, and really excited for this webinar, and welcome, and definitely ask lots of questions.
Great. And Melissa?
Hi everyone, my name is Melissa May. I'm a program manager with GMS API ASF. Been working with the team for about 3 years now, and just finished a master's in education myself, so I'm excited to kind of hear how everyone else's journeys have been.
So thank you again for joining us from the GMS APISF team, and we hope you get a lot out of this. All right, to give you a quick overview, we're going to have the GMS scholars perspective from 3 of our scholars. Then we'll be talking about financial aid and GMS from Arrastia Williams. She's the director of the Office of Financial Aid at Georgia State University. Previously, though, she worked at Johns Hopkins University and very closely with our GMS program. Then finally, I will be answering questions about ones that you've listed, but also about the admissions process that you've for graduate school of education. And lastly, we'll have an opportunity for you to do a Q&A session. Throughout the presentation, feel free to include any questions in the chat, and we are looking forward to having a presentation. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask our scholar speakers to do a quick overview and introduction to themselves. And let's start with Anna.
Hi everyone, I'm so excited to be speaking with you all today. My name is Anna, and I'm originally from the great state of Washington. Between then and now, I got my undergrad degree in politics at NYU. Then I was a 9th grade English teacher in Baltimore City, where I was a full-time teacher and a full-time grad student studying education at Johns Hopkins University. After I left the Baltimore City classroom, I got some more teaching experience in a range of other areas, including teaching English abroad, as well as teaching adult basic education at community college. And most recently, I was trying to keep DC from falling apart, working in the US House of Representatives. And there's a lot in flux going on here in DC right now. So Who knows where I'll end up in a couple weeks, but that's what I've been up to.
Great. Luis?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Louise Toe. Graduated or cohort year 2008. I'm from Honolulu, Hawaii. I started my undergrad at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, but had a long wayward path from there. Took some time off, did AmeriCorps, spent even more deferment time trying to figure stuff out. Then I moved home because my dad was diagnosed with cancer. And then I restarted my undergraduate studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I completed my BA in ethnic studies there. And then after that, I was in DC for a couple years. I worked at a nonprofit called Critical Exposure. And then I did some work for the Smithsonian. And then I came back home again for my dual master's in learning design and technology and library and information science. And right now I am a school librarian at Iolani School.
Great. And Sana?
Hi everyone, I'm Singa. I'm so sorry that my video is not working today for some reason. So I'm cohort year 2008. I started off at Georgetown University studying international political economy, and then went straight and got my master's degree in international education policy. And after I finished my master's, I ended up working internationally for a few years in teacher training and education policy research. And I started my PhD, I guess last year, at Stanford International Comparative Education, and also looking at organizational studies as well. And yeah, so that's where I am, and happy to answer any questions you guys might have.
Great. Thank you all for joining us on the call and helping us with as our speakers for today. I have a series of questions that I'll ask, and then we will continue with the program. So for the first question that I have, it's for all of you, and that's more about how did you decide to pursue education as a career path, and what obstacles did you face if you had any?
I can start. So I grew up in a low-income household, in a low-income community. I attended a high school that was labeled a dropout factory by Johns Hopkins University, kind of ironically. And growing up, I knew that my mom was working multiple low-paying jobs, not because she wanted to, but because she had to, because she didn't have more than an 8th grade education, and neither did my father. So I knew that education was the way out of the hood. And I also knew that policy is really, to me, the most pressing issue. I could never really get into like the mitochondria of a cell, but if we were talking about politics, then I knew that that's what I was passionate about and how I wanted to create opportunities for the people who are coming after me. As far as obstacles go, I just kind of want to say that I prioritized classroom experience before going into policy, because I didn't want to be one of those education policymakers who has never taught in front of children. And so I'm looking forward to telling you about how that experience has informed my work here in DC.
Thank you. Luis?
Sure. So I decided to do a master's in education, partially because I was trying to figure out how I could get into getting a master's program or going into one of the 7 funded areas from having done an ethnic studies undergraduate program. And then so from there, I had gone and done work with Critical Exposure in DC, and that program is essentially taught young people how to use photography to campaign for changes in their communities. So my admissions essay was a lot about how I was using or helping young people use technology to teach themselves how to make changes in their own communities. So I think it kind of came from a mix of my work experience that pushed me in that direction. And then also for my library science degree, I was interested because I was in charge of the archive for that nonprofit. So those two kind of put together influenced my decision to go in that path.
Thank you. Sana?
And for me, I think my interest in education really came from my desire to work in international development and work to empower different communities throughout the world, and especially around young people. And naturally, my focus from development economics kind of went into the importance of education. And I really do believe that it is just the power of knowledge and power of learning and power of thinking that allows people to grow and contribute to societies, to communities, and also to themselves. So that was a natural path for me into education. And one of the reasons why I actually ended up studying international education policy and not public policy was highly influenced by just Gates funding itself. But I'm glad I made that choice because I was able to go a lot deeper into the field of education and make a wider career in public policy and research out of it.
Great. Thank you all. Luis, what was the graduate school application process like for you? And how did you find the quote unquote right program? And did you take the GREs?
Okay, so as far as finding the right program, it was a mixture of things. I think first and foremost, I was looking to get the most bang for my buck because I was concerned that I had taken up all of my deferment time. So if I really was at the last 2 years of my GMS funding, at least that's how I was perceiving it, I was like, okay, well, let me challenge myself and get 2 master's degrees out of these last 2 years. So that was a lot of me pushing myself to do 2 degrees. And then I also wanted to give myself as much career opportunity or career paths to take as possible. And then it was also a mixture of wanting to come back home because I wanted to address some things, some relationships that I had with my family. And then as far as GREs, my 2 programs did not require the GREs, which was lucky in my case because I don't think I had time or tests very well. And then lastly, that the application process was a little tricky because you need to keep track of 2 admissions applications, and they operate on different schedules. And they also, there's certain requirements with each universities where you need to either be very clear about when you're going to start at the same time, or if you're going to be what they call like a concurrent degree. So you really need to pay attention to that sort of designation that your university has for a dual degree or a concurrent program. And I think there's also fine language about that in the Gates policies. And I'm way beyond my 30 seconds, so I'm gonna stop here.
Thank you so much. Sana, how did you decide your program on the PhD level, and what were some of the deciding factors that played a part?
Yeah, for me, the most important thing for the PhD was definitely my research interests and faculty who were around. So making sure that there were tenured faculty who were interested in similar areas that I was doing. So that was probably the primary factor, but other important factors were financial aid packages from universities, knowing that despite having Gates funding, it doesn't cover everything at the graduate level. So trying to figure out how do I strategize most effectively, and just general culture of the school, and knowing that PhD programs are longer than master's programs. They're at least 5 years, at least in education or more. So also deciding in a place where I felt like I could be there for about 5 years. And I also wanted a diverse community. So making sure that the school was very intentional about having a diverse cohort was important for me. And speaking of GREs really quickly, I actually took the GRE, and I know a lot of the ed schools are moving away from the GREs, but something that I found out since being on the other side and being admitted is that GRE scores played a big role in the school deciding on giving me additional fellowships and scholarships. So if it's optional, I encourage you to take it because it might have some financial implications for you.
So now one of the questions that came in is, would you be able to speak about the difference between an EDD and a PhD?
Sure. So based on my understanding, the EDD tends to be a little more professional oriented, and PhDs tend to be a bit more academic. So if you want to become a professor and want to go down the academic path, there are people with EDDs who do teach at universities, but there is this added on prestige that comes with a PhD. Obviously, if you're getting an EDD from like Columbia or a highly ranked institutions, it doesn't matter as much. But EDDs tend to be a little more practice-based, a lot more practical. A lot of the EDDs tend to be around education administration, education leadership. PhDs tend to have a lot more academic focus. So a lot of PhD programs in education will have an element of a core discipline like sociology, political science, economics, or psychology that's as an added part of the program.
Right, and you hit it right on the nail. Also, the other big factor is if you're interested in doing research as a career option, a PhD is the route to go. With EDD, it's more practical based, and many folks who receive an EDD tend to then may teach as an adjunct and then have an administrative job on campuses. So that's just the general gist of the differences. Just moving on. Sorry, just lost my place. Luis, since you were funded in 2 funded areas, how did you manage 2 masters in the 2-year time period? And you touched a little bit upon that. Can you expand?
Yeah, it was a lot. There really isn't much time for much else. Maybe you could squeeze in part-time work, maybe. But I would definitely say that the benefit of doing the 2 years, or the 2 masters in 2 years, is having more career options, as well as, and I want to say this because people are interested in education, when you go into education and you're trying to find jobs in education, I think most often their salary steps are based off of how much education you have under your belt. So the fact that I had 2 masters definitely gave me a place where I could negotiate for a higher salary. So keep that in mind if you're trying to get into certain school systems that may require that sort of thing. And then aside from that, the key for a 2-year program is to, for me, I overlapped as much as possible the work that I did for both of these programs. For example, when I had my capstone project for my MED, and then I also had an internship at the same time for my library science program, I overlapped those as much as possible so I could make most efficient use of my time. And that's just a brief. I can go into more later if other people have questions.
Great. And also, I just want to take a second here. A common question that comes up is, can I do a dual degree program with a funded area and a non-funded area with education? The answer is no. The reason Louise was able to do a dual degree program is because both of her area of studies are fundable. Library science as well as education are both fundable fields. And so her program as a dual degree program was approved. Now, if you wanted to do an master's in education and let's say a master's in public policy, unfortunately, that will not be fundable if it was a dual degree program. GMS would advise you to do your master's in education first and then followed by public policy, which would be a cost on you. Or you can receive other fundable funds for that. Thank you, Louise. Anna, how did you manage your time as a Teach for America core member and attending graduate school? Can you talk a little bit more on the graduate school side of things?
Sure. So for a lot of the most recent couple of decades, there's been a lot of talk within the education community about teacher preparation. And let me just say that not all schools of education are created equal. So I was very intentional about the school I wanted to get my master's of education from. Hopkins and Harvard battle it out every year between who's first and who is not. And that's important because I was able to learn on the ground in tandem with my graduate program. So that meant that if I was learning about social emotional learning, then I would make a lesson plan, try it out with my students, and then reflect on that and really engage with the content that way. So I chalk it up to Hopkins having a very broad-reaching and, just touching on so many different areas that I could apply in the classroom.
Sorry, I was speaking while being muted. Anna, can you also further, you touched upon this earlier about how education has shaped your interest in policy. Can you go a little bit further about how teaching and your master's in education shaped your experience in policy?
So first and foremost, teaching ninth grade English in Baltimore City schools is the most difficult thing I have done and will do. After I have taught 13, 14-year-olds, I've had a class of 32 of them, and I need them all to be focused on one thing, and I actually want them to learn at the end of the 60 to 90 minutes. I can do anything. There's nothing that you can put in front of me at this point that I can't do. So first off, it was just a really great learning opportunity for me to grow as a person. And then as far as, what I got out of my studies, I think it made me a better worker because in comparison now, everything is just so easy. You mean I can go home at 5 o'clock? Okay, cool. I don't have students blowing up my phone all night or something along those lines. And it made me, because I just teach such diverse students, it made me more capable of working with the diverse people that are on the Hill with very big personalities. So and it helps with communication as well, because if I explain something to you and you don't get it, I need to try a different way where you will get it. And so at the end of the day, being able to reach students translates well to pretty much any career I would want it to.
Great, thank you. Sana, can you talk a little bit about, with your PhD application, how did you leverage your work experience? Do you have any tips?
Sure. So before I applied for my PhD program, I actually ended up working for about 3 to 4 years. And with a lot of the education PhDs, it's actually recommended that you come in with some sort of work experience. But you have to balance it with making sure that you haven't done so much work that you can't do like academic research work. So what I ended up doing is I intentionally found opportunities within my job, which was mostly teacher training program design, to kind of add a research component, and kind of so that I can talk about my abilities to do research, to do more academic rigorous data work, quantitative work, while still running my program. So I would highly recommend that you try to figure out what are the opportunities in your current job, workplace, that you can use to talk about academically, but also make sure you can kind of play up the extent to which you can draw from actual real life experiences in the field to inform your research design.
Great. And actually following up with that, can you explain how that differed, that experience that you just described, differed from when you applied to your master's?
Yeah, so when I applied for my master's program, I think I focused a lot more on what I wanted to do with my master's. Especially with my personal statement, it was very much goal-oriented and framed in terms of like how this master's program would help me further my goals and my career. And it was very much specific on like what I want to do and the kind of change I want to bring in. With a PhD personal statement, it was very different. It was less about what I want to do and how I want to change and affect policies or affect programs and improve learning outcomes. But it was more on like, these are the broader questions that I have. These are the things that I'm struggling with and wrestling with. These are some of the questions that came up as part of my work. And I want to spend a lot of time understanding why and the processes and the mechanism. So it became more like a research proposal in my personal statement than talking about the kinds of impact that I want to have. I obviously want to write a little bit about the impact, but the PhD committees want to know more about like, what is your research agenda?
Great, thank you so much. Anna, what was the financial aid process like? I know it was really complicated, but throwing in GMS, it's even more. As a student, what did you wish you knew about the GMS financial aid process?
So I can't speak for everyone's experience, but in undergrad, I had a very difficult relationship with the financial aid office in the bursar's office. I did 5 years in undergrad, and by the 3rd or 4th year, I got a handle on it, and I felt really confident about how to get my funding and make sure there are no bumps in the road. I did not at all know what was going on when I got to graduate school, and I had the pleasure of, and today you will all have the pleasure of, working with Arrastia. She was at the time the director of financial aid when I was still an undergrad actually, and getting ready to enroll at Hopkins. And I'm glad that I proactively emailed before, you know, I even got any letter from Hopkins saying I needed to worry about financial aid. And I'm so lucky because she, first off, knows what a Gates Scholar is, and then also understood that I was doing the Teach for America program. So be proactive, find those people who know what they're talking about, find those people, even if they don't know what they're talking about, who are willing to help you. There was one hiccup in my graduate studies where I think it was like towards the end of the school year with my students. I had signed up for like summer classes and forgot about it, didn't know I had to do anything for it. I got an email from the director of my program, and she said, hey, so your professor said, you know, class has started already, but you haven't participated at all. And it was like, oh, I'm enrolled in these classes full time. So what ended up happening was I missed the deadline for Gates funding, which I'm surprised Gates would have funded, even though it was summer funding. And I ended up having to take out my first loans ever, womp. But I had 2 AmeriCorps grants from Teach for America, so I was able to put those grants towards that loan. But if I hadn't made that mistake, I could have kept it for those 2 AmeriCorps grants for future education. But yeah, I got sloppy and paid for it. So don't think that just because you started getting funding means you can kind of like snooze. With graduate funding, it's very different because you have to renew all the time and keep your partner organization updated on what you're doing and what you're studying.
Can I add something before we move on? This is regarding summer courses. So yeah, Gates, in a few cases, Gates might be able to fund summer courses. And in my particular case, because I was trying to do two masters in 2 years, I had to take summer classes. So that's a situation where Gates will help you with that because they have that time frame that they require of you.
Great, thank you so much. At this time, I'm going to actually switch it over to Arrastia Williams. Ms. Williams, as I mentioned and Anna mentioned, she worked with GMS scholars at Johns Hopkins, but also is currently the Director of Financial Aid at Georgia State University in Atlanta. Arrastia, are you on?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. If you could just go over the financial aid process for graduate school and how GMS works.
Okay. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Anna, for speaking so highly of me. It was my pleasure to help you, and I'm so glad that you're doing well. So for the biggest change with going to graduate school is now you're an independent student. For a lot of you, when you even if you did have financial aid in undergraduate or you didn't have financial aid in your undergraduate school, you were dependent on your parents. So if you completed the free application for federal student aid or the FAFSA, you needed your parents' information. Now as a graduate student, you're going to be just all of your information. You don't need your parents' signature. You don't need your parents' income. You don't need anything like that. So it's all on you. But of course, that means it's all on you. You also will be surprised if you, in your undergraduate, if you received a wonderful thing like a Pell Grant, you will not get that in graduate school. So that's some funding that will not follow you, unfortunately. And unfortunately, with graduate school, the majority of the funding is in the form of federal student loans. You are quite fortunate that you are Gates scholars so that you will be able to receive the funding from Gates. But what's really important is to make sure that the program that you're going into, that you're able to receive the Gates funding. So I looked at the website, and I remember from being at Hopkins, I was at the School of Education, so that was pretty easy. But you have to make sure that you are receiving your information or receiving your degree in the computer science, engineering, library science, mathematics, public health, or science. If you're going outside of those programs, you may not be able to secure funding. What you will have to do is kind of do like Anna did, reach out to the financial aid office for the school that you're interested in, so that they can say, okay, make sure that you go through Gates, and they will send the information to the school. They'll send it to the school. The school will look at your cost of attendance. So for graduate school and undergrad, that's your tuition, fees, books, supplies, personal expenses, transportation, and things like that. And we actually certify back to GMSP the amount of those things. And then Gates will then make a determination on how much of a grant they're sending to the school. Of course, the school is going to take the funds off the top that you owe us, and that's the tuition and fees. And then if you receive a refund after that's gone from the money that you received from Gates, we will give we'll give money back to you so you can take care of your living expenses. So I'm looking here at some of the chats. Someone talked about dependency. As a graduate student, you're automatically considered an independent student for federal financial aid purposes. Are there any questions, or is there something that I didn't address with that?
No, you gave a great overview. If anyone has questions about funding, can you please put it in the chat right now, so then Arrastia can take a look and answer that.
Can you take a gap year? That was probably a Gates question. That's not necessarily one for me that I would know.
Yes, and I'll take that question. Yes, you can take a gap year and still get funding. There's something called a deferment, and there's caps on different deferment types. Please take a look at your GMS handbook to see what the caps are. There is something called an education deferment, where that goes up to 3 years of deferment time, as well as, which is different from service deferment. I'm going to throw it back to the chat.
Okay, so I'm looking here. On the FAFSA, you still uploaded your parents' tax information. Whatever school you go to will completely ignore it anyway. So that you're still, as long as on the dependency questions on your FAFSA, one is, I think the second or third question, or maybe it's further down, asks, will you be entering a graduate or master's program for the next school year? If you said yes, they automatically consider you an independent student. So if you did it online, I'm surprised if it lets you do that. Also, just to remember, if you did have federal student loans while you're in undergrad, because you are going to graduate school, it's important that you contact your lender or your servicer to get an in-school deferment on your loan payment.
Arrastia, can you elaborate? What does that mean to get an in-school deferment?
So you don't have to start repaying your loans as long as you're in school at least half time. So usually when you go from undergrad to grad, or if you go from undergrad and another undergrad degree, as long as you're in school at least half time, you don't have to begin repayment on those federal student loans. So it's important to contact your servicer, and they will actually contact your school, and your school will certify, usually after the second week of school, yes, this person is in school, yes, they're at least half time, so don't send them into repayment. It's very important to do this in a very timely manner, because you only get one deferment for each loan. So those of you who spoke about the gap year, if it's in between your undergraduate and your graduate, you probably will go into repayment. You get a 6-month grace period once you graduate. And so I'm sure you'll be getting notices from your loan servicer. So after those 6 months are done, you should begin paying your loan. If in that gap year, you say, okay, I'll make 1 or 2 payments and now I'm starting graduate school, make sure you let them know. On that loan where you went into repayment, even though you went into deferment, as soon as you graduate from graduate school, you'll immediately go into repayment. You won't get another 6 months of grace period. I know that's sometimes a little confusing.
Thank
So
you.
you only get a grace period once.
Thank you so much. And this is important specifically for students who are finishing off their master's degrees. So students who are beginning to start thinking about their master's, think about how you're going to, because as Sana and Anna mentioned earlier, some master's programs are over the GMS cap. There is master's and PhD programs are capped on the, for GMS. That means that each year GMS sets a capped amount for the full academic year. So that's starting in the fall and going into the summer. Luis and Anna mentioned summer funding. If you have leftover funds from the fall and the spring, then you are able to request that funds for summer funding, the summer after the academic year. Again, so it's fall, spring, summer. And what Arrastia is talking about when we're paying back these loans, it's extremely important to keep this in mind, especially if the cost of the institution is above the GMS cap. Please note that there is a difference between in-state and out-of-state caps. Currently, it's around 48,000 for out-of-state / private schools. Private schools, and for in-state public schools, it's around 40,000. Also note that when I say in-state versus out-of-state, that if it's a public institution, it is still going to be capped at $40,000. So if, for example, if you are trying to go to University of Michigan, which is a public institution, and you're a resident of California, your cap from GMS is $40,000, even though it's you'd be qualified for an out-of-state tuition, which might be a lot higher. Any questions for Arrastia before we move on? All right. Thank you so much, Arrastia. It was a pleasure for having you on the call.
No problem.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go forward and talk a little bit about tips on how to answer questions. Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of this chat. On the admissions process. So timing is everything. And Sanat talked about this a little bit, about thinking strategically about planning, especially for your PhD, as well as for your master's. If you feel your package from undergrad isn't the best package that you can present with your GPA or GRE scores, it's okay to take a year or two off, and GMS completely supports that. As Melissa mentioned in the chat box, GMS does have opportunities for you to take some time off during deferment time, and with that means that you can present a better package when applying to graduate school. So master's programs, I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between an MA master's versus an advanced master's versus an EDD/PhD. A master's tends to be for students who are just recently coming out of college and want to go into graduate school. You tend to need work experience for a master's. It does help, but it's not required. An advanced master's is usually around 60 credits, and that's called an EDM. An EDM tends to require some work experience, maybe a year or two, and it's looking to, some schools let you roll that up to a EDD or PhD depending on the program. You would have to apply separately. But think strategically. Think about the timeline of when GMS is ending, academic year 28-29, and when you would like to enroll in your master's program as well as your PhD. So just keep that in mind. when applying to college, graduate school, think about these 3 questions: why you, why now, and why that institution / school. We want admissions folks want to see why are you connected to this school, and why is it right for you right now. That's important because we want to make sure, as when looking at applications, we want applicants, admissions folks want to see, are you at the right place? Are you looking to advance, to gain knowledge and build on that knowledge? And most importantly, what are you interested about that school right now at that period of time? Number 3, build a narrative that shows a story and doesn't tell it. What's the difference between showing the story when looking at graduate school applications? It's about just showing where you can take what you've learned through your undergraduate experience as well as your work experience, and showing them how you can build and help the community at that institution. Research professors and centers that at a specific school that you're interested in, and see if this aligns with your interests. Sanat touched upon this, and it's extremely important, specifically at the graduate, at the PhD/EDD level, because at that point, you're not students for these professors, you're peers. And it's extremely important for the professors to see you as equals to them. It's a great honor, but also it's a great feat. So make sure you do the research of finding out which professors are doing research that you're interested in, as well as if there's centers. When I say centers, I mean each institution or graduate school of education has different centers. Columbia is best known for their center of community colleges, but they also have a great center for which they're building out right now for college advising. Harvard is really well known for their Center of Education Policy, and they also have a think tank which is connected to their School of Education. These are great and very important, important pieces for you to look into prior to your application process. And lastly, definitely set up informational interviews prior to applying so you know what to hit on for the application. Also, just real quick to run back, one step back, when I say research professors, also make sure you don't find just one professor. You never know what happens in their life. They may need to transfer to a different school, or they receive another offer. So make sure you look at universities who have multiple professors that are interested in different interest areas for you. I know I went through that pretty quickly, but I wanted to just throw it out to see if there's any questions in the chat before I go back and answer the questions that have already been placed in the chat. I'm going to give a few minutes. I'll do.
Kalindi, I might, if it's okay, there's just been a number of questions about deferment in the chat, and since I'm the deferment person, I thought I might just elaborate a little more, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So specific to, as Kalindi kind of touched on before, specific to education majors, we just broadened, in the past you've had to be a teacher in a classroom in order to get teaching deferment, but we've recently broadened the definition for education deferment. So if you're working in any sort of educational capacity, that will be counted as work experience on your application for graduate school in an education program, then that can count. So you can use your education deferment while you're gaining experience for those master's applications. And as Kalindi mentioned, that is up to 3 years. And then every scholar, if you haven't used any discretionary deferment time at the undergraduate level, most scholars will use their year of discretionary or transitional deferment between their undergrad and graduate studies. So just to kind of expand on that deferment deferment conversation. And then there was also a question of working with your partner organization on a case-by-case basis. So I'm happy to work with any API ASF GMS scholars on their deferment cases.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I really appreciate it. And also, real quick, I misspoke earlier. The cap for graduate funding for this academic year is $40,368 for public institutions and $46,614 for private institutions. And real quick with that, I also want to throw in, please consider cost of living in different places. So Atlanta is very cheap in comparison to New York City. Going to Emory, even though it's a private institution, the cost of living in Atlanta is a lot cheaper than, let's say, going to Teachers College or NYU, because the cost of living in New York City is just so much more. Same thing with San Francisco, same thing for Boston. So just keep that in mind when you think about graduate school and when you're applying. Just because GMS isn't funding all of your graduate school doesn't mean that you should not attend. It just means that you're going to have to do a little bit more homework. There's something called graduate assistantships, and since this is a webinar on education, I highly recommend students look for graduate assistantships. The reason is, one, it develops work experience for you, so you're building your resume, but two, also it helps offset the cost of attending a university when GMS isn't covering the whole thing. Yes, majority of graduate assistantships are designated for PhD/EDD/advanced masters, but there are opportunities for master level students. You just have to look ahead of time. So make sure you do your homework, and by doing your homework, that might mean actually the second you receive those admissions letters and the yay, you're in, to start looking for opportunities on different campuses. Each university has these opportunities in different locations. Some house them in their graduate student council websites, while others house this in their job opportunity websites. So do your research, and this is where informational interviews are key. All right, any questions before I jump into answering questions? All right. I'm going to go ahead and answer questions that rolled in earlier. I'm going to just read the question. I'm sorry, I haven't been following the chat completely, so please excuse me if questions have been answered. What is the overall timeline on my end to ensure that graduate studies are funded without delay? So I'm assuming this is talking about when the timeline for the academic year / year. It's the exact time frame as when looking at undergraduate funding. So you do need to finish off and fill out your renewal application over the summer. And there's usually a deadline of July 20, a priority deadline around July 20th that I highly recommend getting your paperwork in and working with your financial aid officer to get that stuff in. For summer funding, this summer funding opportunities open in April, and the deadline for that is mid-June. So keep that in mind when planning out your academic year of how much funding you're receiving.
Hey, Kalindi.
Yeah.
I wanted to interject for a second because that was my question, but something that I didn't know was you I think generally submit graduate program inquiries before you get accepted to them. So I had to, for all of the schools that I applied to, submit a graduate program inquiry, and then Gates would be like, yeah, sure, this one we'll fund, or this one we won't. And then eventually I hope that the ones that are funded overlap with the ones that I got into.
Sure, thank you for bringing up graduate program inquiries. Yes, graduate program inquiries are key. I mentioned earlier that some areas within education are not fundable. GMS has a very strict guidelines on what is fundable, and take a look at your GMS handbook to see which areas within education is fundable. So we do fund areas such as counseling in school counseling, but I mentioned mental health counseling is not fundable. Another fundable area is education policy, but and each program is very different at different institutions. So just because you got a fundable area of, let's say, international education at from Columbia, but you may have get that rejected from Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, as an example. And the reason is we are looking at what the program is offering for you as a GMS scholar, but also what you could do with that degree once you're out of GMS. So thank you for highlighting that, Anna. And what I recommend is actually submitting graduate program inquiry forms prior to actually even applying to schools. They are good up to 2 years. And you do have time of receiving GMS funding. I'm seeing that email addresses are being shared, so I'm going to actually put all of our email addresses up. Melissa added hers, which is melissa.may@apisf.org. So we are at 4:58. I'm going to real quick run through the questions, and what I'll do is, if you want, I can just read through these the questions here in the Zoom chat, and you can stay on and I'll just respond to them. But one that came up before, is there a resource available for GMS that will help graduate schools with application? There's a Facebook group actually called the GMS in Education, or Gates Millennium Scholars in Education. I highly recommend joining that. You can definitely find folks in there that are working in education. In addition, we also have something called Schoology, Schoology.org, I believe, and you can set up your profile and connect with other Gates scholars within education, ask questions there. So I highly recommend going through those opportunities. If you're interested in any schools in the Northeast, definitely reach out to me. That's where what I cover. I cover Boston all the way down to Pennsylvania/Delaware, and then also all the way out to upstate New York. And we are at the 5 o'clock mark. So first off, I'd just like to take a second to thank Anna, Luis, and Sanaa, as well as Arrastia, for their time to joining us today. And for those who'd like to exit, please feel free. I'll sit here and answer any questions in the Zoom chat. Thanks all. What I'm going to do is I'm going to answer the questions that were earlier on that came in prior to the presentations. So for those folks, just give me a second and I'll go through the whole chat to make sure questions have been answered.
Cool.
And what we can do is what I'll do is I'll also take these questions, answer them, and I'll work with Leangelo to see how we can send this out.
I encourage everyone to pore over the GMS handbook with a fine-tooth comb. That is available on Schoology, as previously mentioned. And a lot of the questions that were raised, there are some answers, there's some starting points in the handbook. There's like a whole section just for funding in education.
Kalindi, I guess for that question on how to stay connected with undergraduate professors in order to get letters of recs for grad school, if you're taking a gap year, I think the hope is that during your gap year, you do find employment that is applicable to your graduate application. So I think it is also very significant to have those relationships to write more recent letters of recommendation to enter graduate school.
Right. So, and it's extremely important to have that professional experience letter of recommendation. However, for those students who are applying for EDD and PhD programs, they may need to have professors write those. So that's why it's important also to stay connected to those students. But you're right on point where having folks that are working with you to continue to have that conversation and write about your professional experience. Thank you. That actually answers the next question. If grad school is asking for a letter of recommendation, does it look bad if I cannot get a letter from a professor? So thank you, Luis. So that actually, it really depends on the program. If it's a master's level program, it does not, it does not look bad that you are receiving a letter from a non-professor. As long as they are able to hit on, if they're a supervisor, and they can hit on your different skills, and they can highlight specifically how you use research for those. For Raymundo's question about looking at, the question is, your life goal is to work at the Department of Education or abroad in an administrative capacity, which master's program in administration, education policy, or any other teaching credential? What would be the best route to take later leading up to an EDD? For this question, it's really about what I mentioned earlier with the tips on applying to colleges, to graduate school. It's all about how you show your story, and all of those opportunities are equally accessible and gives you clout on and ability to do what job you're interested in. What's important is to show that you are truly interested in one of those three fields. So, for example, if you're interested in working abroad, and let's say in a study abroad office, that might be actually a master's in international education, where the program focuses on study abroad programs. And this is why it's extremely important to do your homework, because an international education program, let's say at UPenn, is very different than an international education or comparative education program at Harvard or Stanford, or at Columbia. Columbia's program actually does do a focus on study abroad programs and working as an administrator in that role. So it's extremely important to dive into these programs, even though the titles are similar, what their goals are very different. The question on, I'm interested in pursuing a PhD in cultural studies and education at Claremont Graduate University. Could you elaborate on education-related fields of study that GMS does not fund? I'll completely honest, that is a very gray area, cultural studies and education. So I would actually recommend submitting a graduate program inquiry form. Even if you are applying to a non-gray area, such as a master's in elementary education, you still have to submit a graduate program inquiry form. But something like this it's extremely important to do it earlier rather than later, because you may be required to submit something called a course plan. So the earlier you do that, the better. The next question about receiving a PhD in counseling psychology program, again, submit a graduate program inquiry form. Most psychology programs are not fundable, but it depends on the school, and school psychology programs are not fundable. Counseling programs are. So again, it depends on the school and where it's housed in the department. If I'm not interested in research, then is it recommended to do an EDD for, say, a job for Dean of Student Affairs? This is a great question, and we're all students of the internet. So one of my best advice for students with a question like this is something called stalking. We're all really good at it. So I recommend stalking through LinkedIn, through Facebook, to find out what folks who are already deans of student affairs in student affairs, or deans of different colleges, what degrees do they have? In education, it's not the requirements aren't changing for these degrees. Eventually, it might, but currently it has not changed. So I recommend looking to see what other deans of student affairs have, if they have an EDD. Off the top of my head, most students, deans of student affairs, are either working towards an EDD or PhD, or have received it. But definitely look into and talk to folks on campuses. the question of how to defer, Melissa answered the question of what deferment looks like, but how to defer, instead of filling out the renewal paperwork over the summer of the academic year prior, definitely take the opportunity to fill out the deferment paperwork. The deferment paperwork opens up on the exact same day as the renewal paperwork, so make sure you take a minute to do that.
But I will answer the question about when's deferment paperwork due. So during the renewal process, you get a communication from GMS at usually in June, asking you to renew your scholarship or submit a deferment request. And if you are done with, if you don't need funding for this upcoming academic year, then you submit your deferment paperwork, and you do it the same way that you would request funding. You log into your student portal, and then under your requested actions where it says process request for funding, you click on that, but instead of requesting funding, you request deferment. And then it'll ask you some additional information. You'll select the type of deferment you want, and then your partner office will be in communication with you about any additional documentation that's required. And if you don't submit it, then they'll be in more communication with you and call you and email you and find you on Facebook so that you get that paperwork in on time.
All right. We're going to stay on for another 2 minutes because I know we're 15 minutes over. If there's any other questions, feel free to type it into the chat. Melissa, Leangelo, and I shared our contact information, so feel free to email us and to ask any questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. And Leangelo, Melissa, feel free to answer the questions as well.
I also kind of noticed in the chat that we have a few public health people interested in public health that are also on our education webinar tonight. So if anyone is also interested in public health, we're having another Grad Talks webinar tomorrow with the public health as the topic. Same time, same place.
Oh, Raimundo, I think Anna left already. But I'll answer that question of just working full-time in graduate studies. It's very difficult. Time management is extremely important, and making sure that you're on top of deadlines is on both the full-time set on working as well as graduate studies is extremely important as well.
Yeah, I would echo that. I just finished a master's in education while working full-time, but I was only going to school part-time, and still that was a lot to handle. So yeah, your nights and weekends are not your own anymore. But if you're willing to put the work in, then you get a lot accomplished in a short period of time.
Great. Thank you all for joining. We're at 5:16, so thank you for joining. And we, if you have any further questions, feel free to send us an email. Have a great day, and hope everyone's enjoying the weather in the different time zones. I don't even know what the weather's like, but
Thanks, Galendi.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.